Welcome to your deep dive. Today,
Oh, this will be a good one.
we're going beyond the headlines of one of history's most infamous events,
Yeah, infamous is right.
the Jonestown Massacre.
A lot of people have asked us to cover this one.
You've given us a ton of material on this.
And it's heavy stuff.
Everything from the settlement's founding to life inside,
Daily life, yeah.
and even some lingering questions.
Conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah. Expert speaker and I are going to break it all down for you
We're going to sift through it all.
and pull out the most important and interesting pieces.
You know, it's striking how this event often gets boiled down to a simple mass suicide.
Oh, absolutely.
When the
Yeah,
reality
except for much more than that.
is far more layered.
Yeah,
It's essential to consider the historical context,
for sure.
the power dynamics within the community,
Absolutely.
and all the threads that led to this tragedy.
All right, so to kick things off,
Okay.
let's paint a picture of Jonestown itself.
Yeah, let's set the stage.
This wasn't just some random commune.
Nope.
It was officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project.
Official name.
Smack dab in the Guyanese jungle.
Middle of nowhere.
And it was supposed to be this socialist utopia
That's how it was built.
founded by the infamous Jim Jones.
The man himself.
But then, of course, it became known for the deaths of over 900 people in November 1978.
A horrific tragedy.
That remote jungle location is significant in itself.
Absolutely.
Think about it. Being isolated like that fosters dependence on a leader.
You got nowhere else to turn.
And for the people of Jonestown, that leader was Jim Jones.
She had absolute authority.
Now, you'll hear people using different terms to describe those deaths.
Yeah, the terminology gets messy.
Mass suicide,
Right.
mass murder, even just massacre.
Just the massacre.
We'll unpack the nuances of that later.
We'll get into the semantics.
But it's important to acknowledge this wasn't a simple case of collective self-destruction.
It was far more complex than that.
There were layers of coercion,
Layers.
manipulation,
For sure.
and ultimately, violence.
A lot of violence.
And to really understand Jonestown,
To really get
you
it.
can't just parachute in at the end.
Right, you can't just look at the final act.
This story starts long before the settlement was established.
We need to rewind.
We need to trace it back to the roots of the People's Temple
Back to the beginning.
and why people were drawn to it in the first place.
What was the appeal?
Oh, okay, so let's get into that.
Right.
One thing that always strikes me about the People's Temple is how seemingly paradoxical it was.
Yeah, it was full of contradictions.
They called their ideology apostolic socialism,
This weird mix.
this blend of religious fervor and left-wing politics.
A very unique ideology.
They drew inspiration from figures like Stalin and Mao,
Hardcore communists.
but they also managed to gain support from U.S. political figures like Rosalind Carter
Wow, that's surprising.
and California politicians like George Moscone.
How did they manage that?
How did they pull that off?
It's a head scratcher.
Well, they were incredibly savvy politically.
Politically adept, for sure.
They cultivated relationships with influential people,
Networking, baby.
used their community organizing skills for political leverage,
They know how to mobilize.
and even tapped into the Guyanese government's fear of a Venezuelan incursion.
Playing on their fears. Smart.
Basically, they made themselves look like a valuable asset
Yeah, they made themselves indispensable.
on the Guyanese political landscape.
And it worked.
So you've got this group presenting themselves as a utopian socialist community.
All about equality and social justice.
But behind the scenes, they're amassing power and influence,
A lot of power.
both in the U.S. and in Guyana.
Two birds, one stone.
It's a fascinating duality.
It really is.
Exactly.
That duality is key to understanding the complexity of Jonestown.
I agree.
On the surface, it's all about equality and social justice.
A utopia.
But as we dig deeper,
When you peel back the layers,
a much darker reality emerges.
it does.
Oh, yeah.
Let's dive into that reality.
All right, let's get to the nitty-gritty.
After the mass migration from the U.S.,
When they all moved to Guyana,
Jonestown started shifting.
things started to change.
The sources paint a picture of this supposed utopia,
This so-called paradise.
transforming into a heavily controlled
Yeah, it was all about control.
and regimented environment.
Very strict rules.
What can you tell us about daily life there?
What was it actually like to live in Jonestown?
Life in Jonestown was nothing like the idyllic existence that had been promised.
No, it was far from idyllic.
People were working grueling hours in the fields.
Back-breaking labor.
Communication with the outside world was severely restricted.
They were cut off.
And the only news they received was filtered through Jones's own broadcasts,
Propaganda, basically.
which often had a pro-Soviet slant.
He loved the Soviets.
His voice was everywhere.
Always watching, always listening.
I can't imagine being bombarded with propaganda like that constantly,
It would mess with your head.
especially with the heavy emphasis on the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it was all about the USSR.
And then you have these white nights, these surprise drills,
Out of the blue.
where Jones would essentially make the community rehearse for doomsday scenarios.
It's like the world was ending.
He'd present threats like an imminent attack from outsiders
They're coming to get us.
and offer options like fleeing to the Soviet Union
Their supposed safe haven.
or committing what he called revolutionary suicide
His twisted solution.
as a form of defiance.
Dying for the cause.
It's unsettling just to think about.
It's chilling.
Those white nights were a form of psychological manipulation.
Oh, absolutely.
Plain and simple.
No doubt about it.
They instilled fear,
Keeping them scared,
reinforced dependence on Jones,
making them rely on him.
and normalized the idea of suicide as a potential solution.
Planting the seed.
They were essentially dress rehearsals for the final tragedy.
A horrifying preview.
That's not even getting into the harsh punishments.
Oh, the punishments were brutal.
For those who questioned or disobeyed Jones,
If you stepped out of line,
we're talking imprisonment in tiny boxes,
like solitary confinement,
public humiliation,
shame and degradation,
physical abuse,
beatings and torture.
the works.
He had a whole arsenal of punishment.
It was a far cry from the utopia they were
A
promised.
far cry indeed.
What's truly chilling
It's messed up,
is how Jones used the community itself to enforce his control.
turning them against each other,
Children were often separated from their parents and raised communally,
breaking family bonds.
which further tightened his grip
More control for Jones,
by dismantling family structure
erasing those connections.
and making fear and punishment commonplace.
A climate of fear,
He created an environment ripe for exploitation.
perfect for his manipulation.
People were stripped of their autonomy,
No freedom, no independence.
conditioned to obey without question.
Just following orders.
It makes you think about how someone could find themselves in a situation like that,
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
feeling trapped and hopeless.
No way out.
It's easy to judge from the outside.
We weren't there.
But I'm sure there were people who knew things were wrong,
Who had doubts,
but felt powerless to escape.
trapped by the system.
Absolutely.
And despite Jones's attempts to maintain control,
To keep his grip.
cracks were starting to show.
People were starting to see through the facade.
The truth was coming out.
The outside world wasn't entirely oblivious to what was happening.
News was starting to spread.
A custody battle over a child born into the temple,
The Stone case,
media scrutiny,
the press was sniffing around.
and the formation of a group called Concerned Relatives
Worried families.
started to put pressure on Jonestown.
The walls were closing in.
Let's talk about that custody battle,
Okay, let's unpack that.
because it seems like that was a turning point.
A catalyst for change.
Tim Stone, a former temple lawyer,
One of Jones's inner circle.
was trying to regain custody of his son,
Trying to get his kid back.
who was being raised in Jonestown.
Caught up in the cult.
That brought unwanted attention to the temple's practices
Exposing the secrets.
and seemed to really fuel Jones's paranoia.
He became even more distrustful. The Stone case became a focal point for the media and law enforcement.
All eyes on Jonestown.
Suddenly, people were getting a glimpse behind the curtain.
The facade was crumbling.
And the allegations of abuse,
Horrible stories,
manipulation,
dying games,
and financial impropriety
shady dealings.
were starting to pile up.
It was all coming out.
Jones saw this as a direct threat to his authority
A challenge to his power.
and responded by tightening his grip on the community.
Cracking down even harder.
His rhetoric about enemies and persecution escalated dramatically.
He was ramping up the fear. So we've got this community cut off from the world.
Isolated and vulnerable,
A leader spiraling into paranoia and instability.
losing his grip on reality.
And growing discontent among the residents.
Doubts and whispers of dissent.
And then comes a pivotal event.
A game changer.
Congressman Leo Ryan's visit to Jonestown.
Oh, that was a turning point.
Congressman Ryan was responding to concerns raised by the concerned relatives
He was there to investigate,
and wanted to see the situation for himself.
to see what was really going on.
What started as a fact-finding mission
A routine visit,
quickly morphed into a desperate bid for freedom
a chance to escape.
for some Jonestown residents.
Those who saw an opportunity.
And initially, Ryan's arrival wasn't met with hostility.
No, they put on a show.
There was a staged welcome.
A carefully choreographed performance.
to convince the delegation that everything was fine.
See? We're all happy here.
But behind the smiles and songs,
The forced smiles.
you could sense the tension.
Something was off, right? Temple members had been coached on exactly what to say and how to behave.
They were putting on an act,
They were presenting a facade of happiness and contentment.
trying to fool Ryan.
But for some,
But some people saw through it.
Ryan's visit represented a glimmer of hope,
A way out.
a chance to break free.
And that glimmer of hope turned into a floodgate of desperation.
People started to panic.
When several residents saw their chance
They knew this might be their only shot,
and approached Ryan and his delegation,
risking everything.
pleading to leave Jonestown.
Please get us out of here.
That act of defiance shattered the carefully constructed illusion
The facade crumbled.
and sent shockwaves through the community.
Everyone knew things were about to change.
It must have felt like everything was about to unravel.
The situation was spiraling out of control.
This was a pivotal moment.
Absolutely.
Jones, already paranoid and volatile,
On edge and unpredictable.
saw this as the ultimate betrayal.
A personal attack.
The situation spiraled out of control from there,
Things went downhill fast.
culminating in that horrifying attack at the airstrip,
A brutal act of violence.
as Ryan and his delegation tried to leave.
Trying to escape the madness. It was a massacre.
It really was.
Temple members opened fire on the departing delegation,
Just gunned them down.
killing Congressman Ryan and several others,
It's crazy.
including journalists who were there to document the visit.
They were just trying to do their jobs.
Those who survived were left wounded and terrified,
I can't even imagine.
fully realizing the danger they were in.
They had a close call.
You mentioned earlier that this wasn't a spontaneous outburst,
Oh no, this was planned.
and it's chilling to think about how calculated it was.
Jones was a master manipulator.
Jones orchestrated this to silence anyone who might expose him
He had to protect himself.
and to prevent any further defections.
He couldn't let anyone leave. From that point on, there was no turning back.
No way out.
Back in Jonestown, the mood must have been electric with fear and anticipation.
Everyone knew something was going to happen.
Jones knew his carefully constructed world was collapsing,
His empire was crumbling,
and he made a fateful decision.
a decision that sealed their fate.
This is where the infamous death tape comes in.
The most chilling evidence of that day.
You know, whenever Jonestown comes up, that death tape is what people always talk about.
It's hard to forget.
It's a 44-minute recording of Jones's final speech to the community.
His last words,
He tells them they need to commit what he calls revolutionary suicide,
his twisted logic.
claiming it's the only way to escape the evils of the outside world
The world he had demonized.
and preserve their socialist utopia.
The utopia that never really existed.
What's your take on that, having studied this event?
It's a masterpiece of manipulation.
Really?
The tape is a chilling document of manipulation,
I bet.
paranoia,
He was definitely paranoid.
and desperation.
You can hear it in his voice.
You can hear Jones's voice, amplified by loudspeakers,
He's larger than life.
becoming increasingly agitated.
He was losing it.
He paints a picture of a world closing in on them,
Creating this sense of fear.
of enemies at the gate,
Like they were under attack.
of the imminent threat of invasion and torture.
Playing on their worst fears.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to imagine the emotional pressure that must have been building in that moment.
It must have been overwhelming,
These people had been cut off from the outside world,
isolated and vulnerable,
subjected to years of psychological conditioning.
brainwashed, essentially.
And many of them genuinely believed him.
They trusted him with their lives.
It's a stark reminder of how easily our critical thinking skills can be eroded.
We're all susceptible to manipulation.
When we're isolated and subjected to constant manipulation.
It's a dangerous combination. It's important to remember that the people of Jonestown weren't mindless followers.
They weren't robots.
They were individuals who had been subjected to sophisticated techniques of persuasion and control
Very calculated.
that exploited their vulnerabilities,
They were preyed upon,
their hopes,
their dreams of a better life.
and their fears.
And Jones knew exactly how to play on those fears. And yet, even on that tape, you can hear moments of resistance.
Not everyone was completely on board.
Christine Miller,
A brave woman.
a longtime Temple member,
She had been there from the beginning.
argues against suicide,
She tries to reason with them,
suggesting they try to escape to the Soviet Union instead.
their supposed sanctuary.
But her pleas are met with hostility,
She was shouted down.
both from Jones
He wouldn't have it.
and from others who had completely bought into his ideology.
The true believers. Christine Miller's resistance highlights the internal conflict that some must have been experiencing.
Yeah, it shows that not everyone was completely brainwashed.
It's a reminder that even in a highly controlled environment, there were individuals who retained a spark of independent thought.
A glimmer of hope.
It's a tragic testament to how strong Jones's hold over the community was.
He had them completely under his spell.
That even in the face of imminent death, people were hesitant to break free.
They couldn't escape his grasp. And then you hear the sounds of children crying on the tape.
Oh, that's the hardest part to listen to.
Parents trying to soothe them as they prepare to give them the poison.
It's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking.
It's a scene of unimaginable horror to contemplate.
I can't even fathom it.
Those parents were forced to make an impossible choice.
An impossible choice.
Defy Jones and risk witnessing their children suffer a gruesome death.
Or watch their kids die a horrible death.
Or participate in this collective act of self-destruction
Group suicide.
in the hope of shielding them from a perceived greater evil.
Protecting them from the outside world.
There's no way to truly understand the weight of that decision.
No parent should ever have to make that choice. And the method they used was chillingly calculated.
It was all planned out.
It wasn't just some random poison.
No, they knew exactly what they were doing.
It was flavor aid,
Often mistakenly called Kool-Aid,
laced with cyanide and sedatives.
a deadly cocktail.
Medical professionals were even involved in determining the dosage.
To make sure it was lethal. The meticulous planning,
It's so calculated.
the involvement of medical personnel.
It's disturbing.
It underscores the cold, calculated nature of this event.
This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision.
It wasn't a spontaneous act of despair.
It was planned.
It was a carefully orchestrated mass murder disguised as a revolutionary act.
A twisted act of violence. Over 900 people, including over 300 children, died that day in Jonestown.
A staggering loss of life.
It's hard to even comprehend.
A testament to how destructive unchecked authority can be.
When power goes unchecked, this is what can happen. But the tragedy didn't end there, did it?
No, there's more.
We have to talk about what happened in Georgetown.
Another piece of the puzzle.
Right? At the temple's headquarters in Georgetown, Guyana, another tragedy was unfolding.
A parallel tragedy.
Sharon Amos,
A devoted follower.
a devoted follower of Jones,
She believed in him completely.
received a message from Jonestown
A message from Jones himself.
instructing her to carry out the revolutionary suicide plan.
The same plan that was unfolding in Jonestown.
It's difficult to grasp how Jones's influence could extend so far beyond Jonestown itself.
His reach was far and wide.
It speaks to the depth of his control
He had a powerful hold on his followers.
and the way his ideology had permeated the lives of his followers.
They had fully embraced his beliefs. Sharon Amos followed those orders.
She obeyed without question.
She killed her 3 children and then took her own life.
Oh my.
It's a horrifying reminder of the devastating consequences of unquestioning belief
Blind faith can be dangerous.
and the far-reaching impact of manipulative leadership.
Jones's influence stretched far beyond the confines of Jonestown. The stories of those who managed to survive offer a different perspective on this tragedy.
The survivors' accounts are invaluable.
Some escaped the carnage.
They ran for their lives.
Others were given tasks that took them away from Jonestown during those final hours.
They were lucky to be away.
What can we learn from their accounts?
They provide a first-hand look at what went on inside Jonestown. The survivors' stories are invaluable.
They are.
They give us first-hand insight into the psychological manipulation,
The mind games.
the
The
violence,
brutality.
and the desperation
The feeling of being trapped.
that defined life in Jonestown.
It wasn't the paradise they were promised.
Their testimonies help us understand how a seemingly utopian community could descend into such unimaginable horror.
It's a cautionary tale. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture.
The overarching narrative,
The politics, the psychology.
theories, and explanations.
But it's important to remember that this was a human tragedy.
Real people lost their lives.
Each of those 900 plus individuals had a story,
Their lives mattered.
a life.
Hopes, dreams, fears.
People who loved them.
Families torn apart, absolutely.
And amidst the horror, there are also stories of incredible courage and resilience.
Some people fought back.
For example, there was a group of 11 temple members who sensed danger
They knew something was wrong.
and escaped Jonestown on foot,
They took a chance.
walking for miles through the dense jungle to reach safety.
It was a perilous journey.
And then you have the Parks and Bogue families who bravely stepped forward, asking to leave with Congressman Ryan's delegation, knowing they were risking everything.
They put their lives on the line.
Those acts of defiance are truly inspiring.
They give us hope.
They remind us that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit can endure.
The will to survive is powerful. The Jonestown Massacre left an indelible mark on the world.
It changed how we view cults.
It sparked conversations about cults,
For sure.
about the dangers of charismatic leadership,
The dangers of blind faith.
and about the importance of critical thinking.
Question everything. It's a story that continues to fascinate and horrify us.
It's a story that will never be forgotten.
The aftermath must have been chaotic and heartbreaking.
It was a nightmare.
Can you imagine the task of recovering and identifying the bodies of over 900 people from that remote jungle settlement?
A logistical and emotional challenge. It was a monumental undertaking,
It must have been overwhelming.
both logistically and emotionally.
Yes, so many lives lost.
The images from that time are seared into our collective memory.
They're hard to erase.
Body bags being loaded onto planes.
A sea of body bags.
The faces of grieving families.
The pain and anguish.
Sheer scale of the loss.
It's incomprehensible.
It was a stark reminder of the human cost of this tragedy.
So many lives cut short. And as with any event of this magnitude, conspiracy theories started to circulate.
People were looking for answers.
Some blamed the CIA, claiming Jonestown was a mind control experiment gone wrong.
A government conspiracy.
Others suggested Soviet involvement, pointing to Jones's admiration for communist leaders.
The communist angle.
How do you make sense of these theories?
I think they're a way to cope with the unexplainable. Conspiracy theories often emerge in the wake of events that are difficult to comprehend.
When we can't understand something, we try to find an explanation,
They offer a sense of order,
a way to make sense of the chaos.
a way to explain the inexplicable.
They find a reason.
However, in the case of Jonestown, there's no credible evidence to support these claims.
No concrete proof. So you're saying that this tragedy wasn't the result of some grand scheme or government plot,
I don't think so.
but rather a combination of factors specific to Jonestown and the people involved.
It was a perfect storm of factors.
Exactly. So it was a confluence of Jones's manipulative leadership,
He was a master manipulator.
the psychological vulnerability of his followers,
They were looking for answers.
and the isolation and control he exerted over the community.
A closed system. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most horrific acts are the result of human failings, not some elaborate conspiracy.
It's a sobering thought. It's easy to try to find a simple explanation,
A single
a
cause,
single entity to blame.
one person to hold responsible.
But the truth is often far more nuanced and disturbing.
It's rarely black and white. The Jonestown Massacre was a human tragedy,
A terrible tragedy.
a reminder of the dark potential that exists within us all,
We're all capable of darkness.
and the importance of protecting individual freedoms and critical thinking skills.
We need to think for ourselves. One thing that really struck me in the materials you provided was the racial makeup of Jonestown.
The racial dynamics are fascinating,
It's estimated that about 70% of the residents were African American.
a significant majority.
Why is that significant, do you think?
I think it speaks to the racial tensions of the time. The racial dynamics at play in Jonestown are complex and fascinating.
It's a complicated issue.
Jones, who was white,
A white leader.
was incredibly adept at exploiting the racial tensions of his time
He knew how to play on people's fears,
to attract followers.
to build his
He
following,
presented himself as a savior,
offering hope and salvation.
offering a vision of racial equality and social justice
A utopian vision.
that deeply resonated with many African Americans who are facing systemic discrimination.
They were looking for a better life. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained racism was,
And still is.
and sadly continues to be in our society.
We still have a long way to go.
Jones was able to tap into that pain,
The pain of discrimination,
that yearning for a better
a
world,
world free of racism.
and use it to build his following.
He exploited their hopes and dreams.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of blindly trusting those who claim to have all the answers,
Don't believe everything you hear.
especially when those answers come at the expense of individual freedom and critical thought.
Think for yourself. And it's
Huh.
interesting how he kind of tied that in
Yeah.
with his socialist ideology.
The communism.
Right. He presented communism as the solution
Oh, I see.
to both racial and economic injustice,
A one-size-fits-all solution.
which further broadened his appeal,
To a wider audience,
particularly among those who felt marginalized and disenfranchised.
those who felt left out. It's a potent example of how ideology can be used to manipulate vulnerable populations,
Absolutely. It's about exploiting people's needs and desires.
even when those ideologies claim to be about equality and justice.
It's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
It makes you wonder about the fine line.
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
between genuine social movements
Real movements for change.
and those that are more about control and power.
Cults of personality. Absolutely.
Jonestown is a stark reminder that we should always be critical of those who claim to hold all the answers,
Don't just take their word for it.
especially when their solutions require absolute obedience
No room for dissent.
and the surrender of individual autonomy.
Giving up your freedom.
You know, one thing that's always bothered me
What's that?
is how the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
has become so ingrained in our language.
It's everywhere.
It's used all the time to describe blind obedience,
Or unquestioning loyalty.
often in a derogatory way.
Like you're a fool for believing.
But it's crucial to remember
It's important to remember
that the people of Jonestown didn't choose to die.
they were forced.
They were coerced, manipulated, and murdered.
It was a mass murder.
I agree with you.
The phrase drinking the Kool-Aid trivializes a horrific tragedy
It minimizes the suffering.
and perpetuates harmful stereotypes about cult members.
Like, they're all brainwashed zombies.
It implies that the victims were somehow responsible for their own demise,
Like they asked for it.
that they willingly chose to follow Jones without question.
That they were just blind followers.
And that's simply not true.
It's a gross oversimplification.
Right. They were victims of a calculated system of psychological control and violence.
They were trapped.
To say they drank the Kool-Aid completely disregards the complexity of the situation
It ignores the nuances.
and disrespects the memory of those who died,
It's disrespectful to the victims.
instead of using that harmful phrase.
Yeah, let's ditch that phrase.
We should focus on understanding the factors that led to this tragedy.
Let's learn from the past.
What were the warning signs?
What should we look out for?
How can we recognize and resist manipulative leadership?
How can we protect ourselves?
How can we promote critical thinking and protect individual freedoms?
Those are the important questions.
Absolutely.
These are the conversations we need to be having.
So, expert speaker, after diving deep into all this material about Jonestown,
After all that research,
what's the most striking takeaway for you?
I think for me, it's...
What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to remember about this event?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that it could happen again.
Because
It could happen anywhere, anytime.
that's a scary thought. It is, and that's why we need to be vigilant.
We can't let our guard down.
We need to be aware of the signs of manipulative leadership,
The red flags.
and we need to be willing to speak out against injustice.
to stand up for what's right.
Jonestown was a tragedy, but it can also be a lesson.
A lesson we can learn from.
A lesson about the dangers of blind faith and the importance of critical thinking.
Well said. And to you, dear listener, we hope this deep dive has provided some new insights and maybe even sparked some new questions.
We hope you learned something.
The story of Jonestown is a dark chapter in human history,
A chapter we shouldn't forget.
but it offers valuable lessons about the fragility of freedom
Freedom is precious.
and the importance of safeguarding our minds against manipulation.
Don't let anyone control your thoughts.
We've included some additional resources for you to explore, including survivor testimonies, first-hand accounts, historical analyses,
Different perspectives.
and information about cult dynamics.
How cults work.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.